recommendations and actions that will be brought forward not only to COP24, but to the Talanoa Dialogue, the CVF Summit, the Global Platform for DRR, the UN SG's Climate Summit, the Red Cross and Red Crescent International Conference. So there are a number of processes that intersect with this issue that are on the horizon in the next few months, and how do we take some of the discussions that took place here today and feed them into those processes. But I also want to spend time reflecting on how to make what has been heard so far tangible, because someone said to me at lunch today, you know, we humanitarians, we come to these, you know, these policy climate unions, and we hear the message from the scientists, and we understand the dangers, and we hear about the risks. We just don't know what we need to do differently as a result. And so if we can try to answer that question, what does this change for humanitarians? And we started having a bit of that conversation, and I heard a bit of it in the breakout groups, but to really make that come alive, and that will really depend on each of you saying what you think changes in your own roles, to have that be part of the conversation. So we're going to turn now to what I have now decided is the game show portion of today's events, in which each of the rapporteurs from the breakout sessions are going to pitch to us the way that they think we should move forward based on the recommendations that emerged from their breakouts. And our judges panel sitting next to me will then give their decision on how feasible and interesting these recommendations are. So I will first introduce that judges panel, and then we'll hear from the breakout groups. Then we'll turn to you for any thoughts on recommendations that are missing, something that should have been part of the discussion today that wasn't, other issues that need to be taken forward, and then we'll come back to the panel for their thoughts on where we go from here. So to my far right is Ricardo Mena. He is a risk, crisis, and disaster management expert and has been working for the UN since 1993. So makes him slightly older than the under 40 crowd. He leads the UNSISDR's branch in charge of monitoring and supporting the Sendai Framework's implementation globally. Next to him is Marcel Buckebaum. Yes?
No, I'll settle for it.
These Dutch names will never go well with me. He's a career diplomat with a background in trade policy, multilateral affairs, development cooperation, partnerships, governance, and finance, if that wasn't enough, and currently serves as the climate envoy for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. To my left is Elise Lager, Director of Special Projects for the Climate Action Network that we heard from a bit earlier today. She started her career working for the UN on humanitarian affairs in development, and has now been on the climate side, so sees this from all angles, and is now focusing on the Step Up campaign with the CAN members, which is an attempt to really raise climate ambition in the lead up to COP24 to get states to raise their NDCs. And finally, we have Arnel Santos, the first secretary of the mission of the Philippines to the UN here in Geneva. So that is the judges panel. Now, breakout groups, let's see your magic. And I'm going to start with, who shall I put on the spot? Damien, perhaps, are you feeling lively and ready? Damien Cotier, is the humanitarian counselor at the Swiss mission to the UN here in Geneva. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, unlike you can see on the screen, I'm not Philippe Besson, so I've learned like some minutes ago that I should refer on this panel on his behalf, because he moderated the panel, but he was not able to come here now. So I beg for the indulgence of the jury on this, because I had not a very long preparation time. Winston Churchill is said to have told one day that when events go out of control, you should pretend that you have organized it. We don't think that we should pretend that we have organized climate change, but that we should organize the consequences of them. And we all agreed in this panel, where we are in this workout group, where we focused on migration and displacement. We all agreed that people actually do move because of climate change, and that it will continue. Actually, the risk of being displaced by disasters and the adverse effects of climate change has doubled since the 1970s. So people do move because of climate change and disasters, and people will move also in the future because of this. So a shift of focus is needed from managing disasters and the response to reducing the risks of disasters and reducing and managing the risks of displacement. And we should also work, when possible, on the prevention of displacement when it is possible. Secondly, we all agreed to say that disaster displacement is complex and multi-causal, actually with a question on the screen, and everybody, it was very modern, everybody could vote on his mobile phone on what is the biggest cause of disaster displacement. And there were different possible solutions, answers, and we couldn't agree because it was very difficult and for all of us to find one answer, what is the biggest cause, because actually there are many different causes. It's a multi-causal and it's a complex question. What we should do in this context is knowing that that people will move because of this, as I mentioned, we should reduce the vulnerability and the exposure of people at risk of displacement. Concretely, there are many things that we can do. First one, mitigating the effects of climate change on natural hazards by reducing greenhouse gas emission. Sounds obvious, but it's worth mentioning. Working on the prevention, the more than we can, that we can do. Secondly, reduce the risks of disaster through prevention and mitigation measures. Also avoid creating new risks by risk-informed development planning. Another thing that we can do is implement measures to help people at risk of displacement stay in their homes. This includes disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation policies and also targeted investments. We can also implement measures to help people at risk of disasters and displacement move out of harm's way and to move in a safe, orderly, and regular way. Remembers me of something. Such measures could include planned relocation, as well as safe migration pathways. Another thing that we can do is assist and protect when displacement is unavoidable, and this has two dimensions. We should address the internal displacement by building on existing normative frameworks, such as the National Initiative Protection Agenda, but also the guiding principles on internal displacement, who celebrate 20 years this year. And this was internal displacement, and secondly, to address the displacement across borders by creating safe and legal pathways for cross-border movement, using regular migration law, but also using exceptional migration measures when needed, for example, temporary protection or humanitarian visas. And I would like to add something that is not on the PowerPoint that we quickly prepared. Someone mentioned that we should actually continue to speak to each other as we do today between humanitarian and climate scientists, not only to understand and not only to learn from each other, but also to understand each other, because someone mentioned actually we speak different languages and we should learn to better understand what the other means and what the consequences of what one part of the community is analyzing and saying as what the consequences are on the work of the other one. So have this kind of meetings as we have today many different times. Thank you.
Okay, so Gameshow candidate 1 wants to prevent displacement, create safe pathways for migration, help people stay in their homes. Very humble goals and ambitions. Thank you, sir. Next candidate is Nathalie, another Dutch name. Elise Lager. Nathalie, I apologize. The Deputy Permanent Representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Over to you.
It sounded perfect, Hiba. Thank you. So yes, I'm reporting back from the breakout session number 1. And it came to my mind, that, but I don't know who said it, never waste a good crisis. I think it exists in every language. We discussed water. Water means life, but water can also mean crisis. Because when there's too much or too little, we either have a drought or a flood. The only way, and this is a recommendation, to handle this complex process and do something about it is that we bring more different knowledge together. So also in the field of water, we need to know from the humanitarians, what do they face, what kind of pragmatism can they bring in, but also we need to know from the financial world, how can you ensure, for instance, crop loss when you have a flood. The second item was food. It was stated that food insecurity has two major triggers: conflict, man-made conflict, and climate change. I actually asked how much man-made conflict also comes about from, scarcity. And then if it's food scarcity, it's, again, usually related to climate change. So maybe it's even more than 50-50. And the big recommendation that came out was if you would invest $1 forecast-based, because when you can forecast climate and you use the research that's out there, you can predict a crisis. And if you would put $1 already upfront instead of when the crisis hit, you would save $3 to $4. So it was really a pitch for forecast-based financing, which of course in the humanitarian field is not yet done, but policymakers and humanitarians could get together and see if they could make a financing scheme that would allow for that. On health, actually, it's very clear if you take those other two into account, what it means for water, what it means for food, then of course it means something for us, human beings, in health. Think about waterborne diseases, malnutrition, etc. Health problems are on the rise, already known by, of course, a lot of humanitarians that work in the health sector. So actually, if you think about health and disasters and climate change, you really put the human face of climate change out there. So then we came to a general conclusion, which is that the SDGs really set a positive agenda for the future, for our kids, next generation, to live in a better world. If we would be able to also document or value harm that we can prevent from happening, we would really probably get more urgency in implementing the SDGs.
Great, thank you. So a pitch for forecast-based financing, but also for documentation of the value of prevention as part of the wider narrative. We are going to turn now to our third candidate, Marcel van Elst, who you heard from earlier today, of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center.
I could be very brief and just say all of the above, and then maybe add a few more. That's a stiff competition that you're putting me in, and going last, having so many good items already taken away. Those things actually did come up. I mean, we had a particular focus on the most vulnerable. So in the Talanoa dialogue spirit, we started hearing a couple of those perspectives from small island states, from Malawi, for instance, countries where 225% of their GDP was wiped out in one single storm. We actually heard examples of solutions then as well, and a couple of exciting ones. Forecast-based financing, for instance, in Malawi, already happening, I think actually with Dutch support. So you can take credit for that. Yeah. But clearly also financing systems not going to scale, and in particular climate financing systems currently not being fit for purpose to address the humanitarian needs we face today. That sometimes relates to issues of scale. There are challenges getting that funding to be applied at the local level where many of these solutions need to be found. At the same time, those local solutions also need to be scaled up. There are also issues with particular humanitarian challenges, like delivering in conflict areas. And speaking of the problem space, we heard very clear calls for more attention for the impacts of climate change, not just in causing conflicts, but also hurting people already affected by conflict, the double vulnerability. In terms of solutions not already mentioned, and in light of time, even though I could try to more eloquently repeat the good suggestions we already heard, I'll try to just add the ones that I think we haven't yet heard. So there was one clearly on financing. There was one very strongly on presenting evidence, so getting the local stories out, but also in ways that add up as evidence, also to influence those financing streams. I think it matches a little bit what you said about the SDGs, finding the metrics also that speak to those global discussions. Then finally also a bit the pitch I made this morning as well about us all being the ambassadors for this issue, humanitarians needing to speak out more confidently on these issues. That partly relates to the question of evidence. It partly also relates to how we speak about the evidence when we go out. We had an interesting debate, maybe finally to close off. There were calls for more attention on greenhouse gas mitigation from the humanitarian side, and us all needing to be stronger ambassadors for that, given that our humanitarian situation will get out of hand if we don't address that side of the problem. At the same time, there were also, and I think everyone agreed with that, by the way, but there were also the counter voices saying, actually, the international community has focused way too much on mitigation so far. The climate discussions are dominated still. The financing discussions are dominated by discussions about reducing greenhouse gases. And we need to redouble our effort actually addressing the adaptation of the most vulnerable groups.
Great, thank you. So focus on getting the evidence and the story and the narrative and the role that humanitarians can play in that, as well as shifting or balancing the focus between mitigation and adaptation, if I'm to give a crude summary. Thank you to our three candidates. So I will let you take your seats, and if there are questions or clarifications, we'll come to you from the floor. And now I'm going to turn to the judges panel for their reactions, and I'm being a bit silly with this game show analogy, but really, what are of these ideas the ones that stand out to you? Where are the gaps? And for some of the ideas that are slightly more ambitious and high level, what are some of the entry points to be able to move them forward? So Ricardo, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this judges panel. It's tough to be a judge. But anyway, I'll try to do my best. I think I have heard lots of participants and comments coming from the different working groups that refer to many of the things that are already encapsulated in a way in the global plan for reducing disaster risk. This is, as you know very well, this is the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. And we have heard about how to move from managing disasters to managing disaster risk, and how to give more attention to a preventive, or if you want, an anticipatory vision towards the problem, not just reacting to when things have already happened, but to work ahead of time to make sure that we can reduce the impact of not only climate risk, but in general disasters, and how to reduce vulnerability and avoid creating new risks. Actually, the goals of the Sendai Framework are to avoid creating new risk, reduce existing risk, and strengthen resilience. So, in a way, the recipe on how to deal with these issues is already out there. But it's really interesting to see how, in a way, we are talking about the same things, but with a little bit of a different language. And this shows that there is still very much a siloed approach to these issues, and there is not enough conversation and discussion happening between the climate change communities and the DRR communities and the humanitarian world and the development world. So we need to make that happen. So I would say, in terms of that, there is already a tool. Countries are working on its implementation, so we don't need to necessarily start from scratch. And this is a work that is going on already for a number of, I would say, potentially a little bit more than 2 decades. So perhaps I stop there. I can go much longer, but...
No, that's great. I've bullied them all to be very concise so that we have more time to engage with the audience. I'm going to turn to you now, Elise, for your reactions.
Thank you, and it's interesting to be here as a judge. I actually think we will be judged by future generations, all of us, and I'm here as a director for CAN International, but also as a mother of 2 children, and I always think of them of what kind of world are we going to leave behind for them. So I think from what I've heard, and I would like to, the key takeaways for me are actually from the science panel we heard this morning. We heard from Valérie Masson-Delmotte that 0.5 degree does matter. It matters for hundreds of millions of people. And if we don't act urgently on climate change, we will face a global humanitarian crisis. So I think this is why this dialogue today is so important, to really make the connection between climate science and people. And I'm so happy that we were able to pull this event together with the Netherlands, Fiji, Switzerland, Cannes, IFRC, and all the partners here who are here today. So I think the other thing I heard is that the current climate pledges are not enough. The NDCs that was submitted in Paris would take us to a +3 degree temperature increase. And so there is an urgent need for all countries to step up and raise climate ambition. And the goal that is being set in the IPCC 1.5 degree report is to cut carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 and get to reach zero carbon by 2050. That means a radical transformation of our societies. So there's no time to lose for that, and that can actually be an opportunity to innovate, to create jobs, to improve quality of life. I think there's also a positive message of hope and the opportunity to maybe change our lifestyles. And the other thing I heard from Deborah Roberts was that ambitious mitigation is the best form of adaptation. This is also something I heard from Mr. Alban Ishoda from the Marshall Islands as CVF chair, is that for them, if we go beyond 1.5 degree, there's actually, they won't be able to adapt to anything because their country will be wiped out from the map. So for them, it's really a question of survival, and I think they've sent a very strong message of urgency and call for solidarity, an invitation to all countries to join the CVF summit on the 22nd of November. The CVF is a coalition of 48 countries, and there are also many other countries that have already confirmed their participation, including the Netherlands, Canada, France. I'm sure we can count on the Netherlands, Philippines to raise climate ambition and enhance their own NDCs. So the challenge is to really try to foster global climate leadership with a coalition of front runners, and the Marshall Islands and Fiji are setting the example by walking the talk and actually raising climate ambition at home. So if they can do it, why the other countries are not doing it? So this summit in November will be a very important moment as a response to the IPCC report, as a call to all countries to raise climate ambition, and as an input to the Talanoa dialogue at COP24. I also wanted to mention that some of the key outcomes of this dialogue today will feed into the Talanoa dialogue process. That was something we really wanted to make clear. And the Talanoa dialogue is a very important process because it was agreed at COP21 in Paris to take stock of where we are, where we want to go. We know that the NDCs that are on the table are not enough, and countries don't have that much time to submit new NDCs by 2020. So that's also a test for the Paris Agreement, for the 5-year review cycle of NDCs. There's not much time, there's no time to lose. We need COP24 to send a very strong political signal. We're hoping that there will be a decision adopted by all countries to trigger that process for all countries to review their NDCs by 2020. And if they start early 2019, it's actually not much time, only 1 year if the NDC process is a consultative process that is engaging all actors of society, all sectors, NGOs, business, cities, all these actors that will make the NDCs possible to implement. Countries do need at least 1 year to work on their new NDCs. And we know that we can only succeed in this transformation if we have people on board. And so if we also have all the actors of society on board with us. So these would be the key takeaways for us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to you now, Arnel, from the perspective of the Philippines and some of the countries that are more affected by climate change. What you felt was most poignant in some of the recommendations that were made from the breakout groups, but also some of your takeaways from this morning.
Thank you. So, well, before I begin, I'd probably like to share with you first why we're very honored to be invited to this panel today. The Philippines was president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum back in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. And I happened to be, well, I was among the privileged ones to be part of the delegation. and I saw how the international community actually came together to make sure that the 1.5 degree goal is included in the Paris Agreement. There was a lot of skepticism at that time, and it was not until the last minute that we finally came to an agreement to have it included in the text. And we consider it a very important victory for us, the Philippines as a developing country. And 3 years later, well, this is where we are now, we have the report, and it basically confirms what many of us in the CVF, the most vulnerable developing country nations, knew and felt all along was correct. And this report actually encourages and saddens me at the same time, but not for the reasons that you might think. It's encouraging because well, finally we have this study that shows, that demonstrates that we really need to act. It saddens me because many of the recommendations that I heard earlier are actually not new. They are the same recommendations we've been hearing for several years, the same recommendations that we have been hearing being articulated by different delegations, exactly the same recommendations that we hear in different international organizations, whether it's in the UNFCCC, whether it's in the other UN bodies. Would like to think that this has both positive and negative implications. It's positive because that means that the message is out there and people are repeating the message. But I think we also have to take it with a grain of salt in the sense that this has to be the last warning that we need to really be able to act. And I'm from the government, I'm from foreign affairs, and therefore I tend to provide a government perspective to the discussion. And the government does play a role in creating an enabling environment. And there was mentioned earlier about the need for targeted investments, and that's absolutely correct, that's absolutely true. Just need to point out that for businesses to become really engaged in climate change and climate action, we really need to have a wide changing of mindsets. And my former ambassador used to call climate action by the private sector not as corporate social responsibility, but as corporate moral duty. And it's something that we must do, and it's something that should be done not just by the private sector and by the government, but by all sectors of society. In the ILO, there is talk about just transition, in the sense that when we do transition to climate-friendly industry, we need to be able to equip our workers to make sure that they keep up with the change. Again, that has been on the table for quite some time, and we do hope that this report will serve as a catalyst for making sure that it does happen. In the Climate Vulnerable Forum, we have a mechanism called the V20, and this relates to an earlier discussion about climate financing, and discussions are being held by the finance ministers of the CVF, and the purpose of the discussions is precisely to find a way to incorporate climate financing in the national programs of the member states. And there's still a lot of issues that need to be worked out. It's a very complicated discussion, but at least discussions are taking place. And the important thing is that climate discussion is not limited to climate change negotiators alone. In the V20, we actually have finance ministers talking about climate change. And this cross-sectoral approach is, I think, very important if we're going to achieve any progress. The Philippines is a member of the Geneva Pledge. The Geneva Pledge ensures that discussions in the Human Rights Council, we talked about climate change, climate justice earlier, are not limited to the Human Rights Council. That we need to make sure that negotiators in the Human Rights Council actually talk to negotiators in the UNFCCC. Otherwise, we'll all just be in an echo chamber. We're talking about the same report, quoting from the same studies, without really going far anywhere. And finally, I'd also like to take off from a point raised earlier about the need to put the human face, and I was actually talking to our president right now, Marshall Islands, about this just before the panel started. I come from a coastal region in the Philippines, and I can assure you that when we talk about rising sea levels, it's not just statistics. The shoreline from the town where I came from is different from when I was young. And the sea is literally taking the land. And this means that many of the trees that were planted before have now wilted because of siltation, solidization. So when we talk, therefore, about making sure that we act on climate change, it's not a matter of climate action being an impediment to economic progress. On the contrary, I don't see economic progress happening without climate action. It does not make sense, because if you look at the economic cost of typhoons that increase in frequency every year, how do I put a figure to that? Climate action does not inhibit economic growth. As a matter of fact, I would argue that climate action is necessary for economic growth. And finally, and perhaps I can close with this, there was also mentioned earlier about the need to protect migrants, those displaced by climate change in a safe, orderly manner. Also reminds me of a discussion taking place in another forum. Also want to point out, and this on a personal level, that the SDGs refer to everyone, that climate action refers to everyone. It does not refer to any specific group of people, whether in regular or in irregular situations. And I think we need to be mindful of that when we create any policy that serves to address climate change. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So our last judge, and I hope panelists or candidates that you feel the judges are doing you justice with their feedback, is Marcel van Acker, who is, as we mentioned earlier, the Special Envoy of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Hiba. And it is indeed difficult to be the fourth in a row. Also, the term judge is difficult for me to accept. Many of you have followed the news this week and know that the Dutch government has had a fierce slap on the fingers from a judge, losing a court case on the climate action that the Dutch government is taking. So I think, again, adding another layer, another dimension to climate action, and that is the legal route. First it stayed within the halls of climate negotiators. You've heard the panel and also the different speakers that saying, well, this is moving much beyond those halls and taken up in the business community, NGOs, etc. But this is, I think, the next phase that we're entering, the one of legal action and cause and effect. So that's, I'm not here as a judge, but I do want to reflect on what I've heard today and what I've heard from the three breakout groups. And let me remind us of the very reason why we are here today. And that was an initiative taken by the organizers of the event. And that was to bridge the gap, or whatever you want to call it, between the climate world, the climate negotiators, the climate silo, the climate bubble, another label that you could put on it, and in this case the humanitarian world. And that is, I think, a lesson that has been learned the hard way as well. We shouldn't stay within our own silos, and I think Damien said it in his feedback from the workshop. This is a complex issue, and complex issues, wicked problems, can be solved in isolation. So you have to look at it from all dimensions. And when it comes to the humanitarian world, where we have heard many stories today where climate change is having its effect and where many people know it's going on and it has changed the work of people in this field. But the message that this session here today should bring across is that it also takes a different kind of a mindset, a different way of looking. not necessarily more funds or master plans that encompass everything. It is just looking at what you're doing and is it still the right thing to do given this changing context. And that is something that I've heard from all three, because they mention things like combine knowledge between North and South, use knowledge to your best ability to assess those new circumstances. Be inclusive, something like that Martin said is something that this panel and this day also radiates with representatives from across the globe and bringing those different perspectives in. And that is one reaction that I would like to give to Damien as well, who said, well, we have this complexity. First of all, a word of encouragement, don't let that discourage you. We have heard others say, we should just start and allow ourselves to make mistakes, because I think that was the Costa Rican minister this morning saying, we are doing this for 10, 20 years already, and we've learned it the hard way, but at least they are where they are now, almost 100% renewable in their energy supply, and that is something that you don't learn overnight, and that is definitely not something that you can put on paper and send out, this is how we're going to do it. So starting and almost ignoring the complexity, or at least not let it discourage you, is very important. Having said that, another example that I heard from the working group was the idea to keep people in their homes, which might be a very interesting and noble objective when it comes from the perspective of migration. But if you take, and I think that is necessary when it comes to climate change, if you take a long-term perspective and you could predict, another word that I picked up from the panel, if you could predict these weather patterns to stay the same over years, you could also predict that perhaps agricultural production will never pick up in that particular area anymore. So perhaps you should not keep people in their houses in that particular area. So what I would like to say with that is it's always context specific. So use that knowledge to your best capabilities and assess the situation. And sometimes indeed replacement could be an option. And that is not any recommendation to what is your specialty, but the point is perspectives and zooming in, zooming out, and at the least taking a long-term perspective matters. Then finally, Hiba, one point that I've heard throughout the day, and that is the importance of language. Crossing gaps and joining different silos or bubbles to each other sometimes means you have to learn another language, otherwise your meaning could be lost in translation. And one thing is, what is very interesting, if I look around this beautiful hall that has been designed almost 100 years ago, and I looked up the Wikipedia page for this. This was an architectural competition to design a palace for the League of Nations, so the predecessor of the United Nations, to allow discussions independently and easily in an easily and calm atmosphere, dealing with problems of an international dimension. Well, what have we done today here? We have done just that in a very calm and civilized manner. But the point that I would like to make here is another one. This situation might have served that cause 100 years ago, but it's giving me the impression now that we are in a kind of a fortress, that people that we are actually talking about, we make it difficult for them to join the conversation. So having panels on a stage like this, being in a hall like this, having to go through security and all, is perhaps not the right message that we want to spread. So think about language, the language that you use, but also the non-verbal communication, because you might see that people feel kind of reluctant to join you in your quest. So that point I would like to finish off with.
Since you mentioned it, Marcel, and somebody in the audience asked it, how is the government of the Netherlands planning on implementing the court ruling? And you may not be able to speak on behalf of the government, but we also have Nathalie here. Sorry to put you on the spot, but do either of you want to just respond to that question?
No, of course I do want to respond to that. And it is first of all seen as a big encouragement and a stick that has to push us forward. We have to realize that court cases tend to take a long time. And this court case was started in 2013, 2014. And the first ruling was around that time, 2015, or I think, a lower court saying, indeed, dear government of the Netherlands, you have to really take it up a few notches, because in 2020 you need to have 25% emission reduction, and you're not on that pathway. Since then, the government has responded, and the current coalition has raised the ambition to a level that we think we are reaching that target, but still that is something that the critics say just. So we need to still do more, and that is the debate that's currently taking place within government. So the 25, given a little margin of mistakes, of some say between 22 and 27, 28, we will land in that field. But it's, the government ambition is to have a emission reduction target in the EU of 55% in 2030. And if you start calculating back from that, we know that we have to do more, and that is why we are negotiating a climate agreement in the Netherlands at the moment that has to be ambitious in all fields.
There are a few questions in Mentimeter which I will pose to the panel when we come back to the panel, but I first wanted to open it up to the floor and ask a few key questions. Is there anything missing from what you've heard today that should be taken into account? Because, of course, there are people taking notes, and all of this, as we'll talk about in a minute, will feed into other processes. So are there any key issues or recommendations that haven't yet been addressed? Reactions to some of the recommendations that have been put on the table. And then finally, that question that I asked off the top, which is, what should humanitarians do differently as a result of these discussions today? So I saw a hand in the back, and if you can also just identify yourself.
Rebecca Bradsby's from City University of New York, and my question is... Sorry. Is that better? Okay, yeah, I can hear this better. Rebecca Bradsby, City University of New York, and my question is, while we are breaking down the silo between climate science and humanitarian interventions, why aren't we also breaking down the silo with human rights? There's a tremendous amount of work going on in the human rights field that should be feeding into this discussion that we're having today.
Yes, in the corner.
Sarah Houghton from UNISDR. I just want to flag something for Ricardo about, from UNISDR, since many people were mentioning about monitoring the impacts of climate events, and so just wanting him to unpack a little bit what's happening with the Sendai Framework and monitoring, because there is action happening on that.
Is she your communications person? Other comments, reactions, points to be taken into consideration? Yes, at the back.
Devendra Rana, Climate Action Network. I'd just like to echo one of the panelists who mentioned the sort of sense of basically the sort of speed of action, the reaction. We heard in the panelists this morning that we really have to move fast. We don't have much time, maybe 10, 12 years before we do overshoot. I didn't really get a sense of that. Whole bunch of events happening next year, big events, big convenings, but do they actually include, or is it open enough, as Marcel was saying, that includes all the people? We had the youth ambassador yesterday at the exhibition. Well, there are some youths around here, but are their voice heard? There's a march tomorrow. There's a debate this evening at the university in Geneva. Where are these voices being heard? So, to me, two things. One is speed of action. There are all these big gatherings going on, important. And then the other is, how are we getting other sectors, other actors involved? And there should, I think, be a really conscious movement to bring more people into the debate. Thank you.
But if I may, I mean, we're talking about bringing other people into the debate when actually the key players aren't even at the debate. And if I look around the room, I mean, where are most of the states? And why are they not here? What's that? They generally only come for the morning session. But I mean, from those who are here, to what extent the state of Palestine, oh, sorry, I will come to you in a moment. But to what extent is this a priority, and the focus on the humanitarian implications enough of a priority in the wider governmental process is another point that I would raise. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have no comment about the absence of the states here, but my concern is the goal number 17, partnership. This is very important, to work all together to achieve our SDGs. But this needs one essential thing, funding. I think this is the answer of your question about the absence of the states here. Thank you.
Yes.
Alison Meston from UNESCO. Just very quickly, the High-Level Political Forum next year is looking at SDG 13, and if your state, if your country is part of the voluntary review of the High-Level Political Forum, this is one place where SDG 17 can be brought into play, because any NGO or any organisation can do a shadow report that can be presented to the High-Level Political Forum. I think there's about 20 countries that are up for review, and that can be found by Googling your country. But I would highly recommend, as a recommendation from this forum, that there be a process by which particularly civil society organisations can do shadow reporting at the High-Level Political Forum next year on the SDGs.
So thank you for that transition, because there was another question from the floor, and I'm going to come back to the panel but inject a couple more from the reactions that we've just heard. And one of them is linked to the point Alison just made around how to ensure the participation of affected communities, especially at the local level, on these kinds of climate policy discussions. And certainly we've had a lot of representation here from affected states, but if we get even lower down from that, what is the way forward in terms of ensuring that they're at the table? Another question was around how to raise, and you can treat these as questions or treat them as recommendations, how to raise awareness about the economic costs of inactions. And so if you frame that as a recommendation, you know, should more investment be put into creating that evidence base? And another comment mirroring that, to better scientifically document the humanitarian effects of climate change, as we've heard over and over this morning. And finally, and I think I've heard this also from a few of the panelists, to create a permanent human rights and humanitarian dialogue that can break some of the human rights humanitarian silos and the wider human rights versus climate silos, to create this kind of forum on a more regular basis. So with those thoughts in mind, I'm going to turn back to the panel for their last reflections. And really the key question would be, in trying to move forward, what is one action point that you see as the priority moving forward, and how do these discussions plug into the various processes? And maybe we can go the reverse order, and this time start with you, Elise, and particularly with your links to the CVF summit. What happens next, and what's the one thing you'd like to see move forward?
Yes, so what's happening next? I think we said already there was a strong call from the Marshall Islands to all countries to join the CVF summit. And that's all, but there's also a call for action and ambition at COP24, and I'm very pleased that Poland is in the room with us, because I think that's also a message from the IPCC report and the humanitarian community here about the urgency to act and to raise climate ambition. In terms of also maybe what I've heard here in the room, so you did talk about the cost of inaction, but I think we should also talk about the benefits of action. So we know that in 2017 there was a record of, in terms of climate-related natural disasters that costed $320 billion. But actually, bold action could deliver $26 trillion of US dollars in terms of economic benefits. And there could also be 65 million new low carbon jobs created by 2030. So I think we should also look at the positive side of the story and the potential benefits of climate action in a positive way. And in terms of what I've heard as well, I think you are totally right that climate change is also an issue of human rights, especially if you look at migration and displacement, and also the fact that we need to address climate change if we want to be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So in terms of basic rights and access to food and water and energy, there's really an issue there. If we don't address climate change, we won't be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that's also a very important point that has been raised.
Marcel, why don't I come to you? I'm saving you for last this time, Ricardo. Marcel, go ahead.
Thank you, and I think very valid points have been brought up from your side. I just pick out a few. The one on the silo of human rights and human rights organizations. In a way, you could make that point broader. And I arrived yesterday here in Geneva, and since I was here, I also took the time to visit a few of the other organizations, and basically came to the same conclusion that there are several silos just in Geneva, but I guess that's a general point, that have to be broken down. That is the very point of climate action. Climate in itself is nothing. Climate has to be attached to a certain theme, a certain region, a certain topic to make it tangible, and to have professionals like you get into action mode, because then it gets real. So I also went to the permanent representation of the Netherlands, and although they are completely exhausted by organizing this one, I already suggested them to organize the next one. For example, next year when the ILO celebrates its 100th anniversary, perhaps that's a good reason to break down that silo, although I have to say to ILO's credit that they do take this in already, because there are many initiatives coming from that side, seeing what the future of work is. That's another SDG. And what the social consequences of the transition will be, and looking at the silo that I often am in, that one of climate negotiators, I think some of the lack of progress and the lack of speed, I think it was brought up from the back, has to do with that very aspect, that politicians are always afraid of the short term, the next election, and if they come up with measures that are getting too deep into employment, for example, by closing down coal-fired power plants, for example, they might want to save that for their successors. So there is a strong link with the ILO agenda, and that could be a next one to address in another hole than this one. And the same, and I think that might be even more important, is the one on trade. That's another constituency here in Geneva. When you want to change, you often just have to follow the money, and that is global trade relations. That whole system might need a critical look, because we have to move from the linear system that we have, moving a product from the one place to another and in the end of its life cycle discard it. That needs to become more circular, and that means that we have to come up with complete different ways of organizing ourselves. So there are many silos, and that's another point I would like to take from the floor, is how are you going to change that? Not by asking the turkey what he wants to have for Christmas. We have to bring in others, and young people are a crucial force in this, and I try to bring, for example, the Dutch youth representatives to places like COPs, but also I mentioned the negotiations for a Dutch climate agreement. We've made sure that at every table there is a young voice to bring their expertise to the table, and I can only encourage all of you to do that. And if you can't open the silo or you can't open a door, I'm here to ask for advice or to break that open, because that is what I've done in the past as well. Finally, in terms of awareness, it's sometimes just using simple examples. And an example that I've heard here today, and I'm doing Natalie a favor here by mentioning it from this stage, is when you look at the practice of humanitarian action and you want to include climate change thinking into that, sometimes it's just as simple as thinking of bringing in food and the means to produce food in dire situations. You can bring in a pot that has to be boiled by using wood, or you bring in a solar-powered cook stove. It's sometimes just as easy as that, and that's the climate choice that you can make. And I understand that thinking is going into that direction, but action is sometimes lacking, and I think we need those simple examples to make it tangible for everyone.
Ricardo.
I did refer on my first round about the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. And building on that, I would like to say that countries agreed on this plan for reducing disaster risk and agreed on 7 global targets and a set of indicators that have been defined since 2015, and countries have been working on their implementation. And we will have soon, actually in May 2019, the opportunity at the global platform for disaster risk reduction that is going to be convened and organized by the UNISDR and hosted by the Swiss government, the opportunity to take stock of what progress countries have made in terms of implementing the disaster risk reduction plan. Now, I said at the beginning the big issue of trying to avoid working into silos. Because, and I'm going to refer to some of the aspects of the Sendai Framework that are very, I would say, common to both climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian actors, and also, of course, sustainable development actors. And they have to do, for example, with the fact that Sendai Framework invites governments to, by 2020, substantially increase the number of countries that have national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. Now, when we think about the impact of climate change and adaptation in particular, what we are really talking is about climate risk. It's floods or droughts, it's storms with, more intensity, perhaps more frequency. We are talking about hurricanes, we are talking about droughts, and this is the agenda that has been underpinning all these disaster risk reduction discussions and global agendas. So it's a matter of using all those capacities and information that has been already developed under that framework to make it also of use to the climate change adaptation community. For example, for a long time already, we have been supporting countries to have national disaster loss databases. Because what best way to know what your risks are and geographically defined than knowing what impact you are suffering from? And here we are not just talking about, the very intense but infrequent disasters, but also those that happen with very high frequency that may not be so intense, but they also generate lots of losses. Actually, earlier this week, we released a report that has compared a 20-year period, 2017 to 1998, going back, with the other 20-year period just before that. And we have found that disaster losses related to climate risk has more than doubled. So 151% increase from the previous 20 years. We already know that. So we have to try to, as I said, make space to have the possibility of discussing together about these issues. And actually the global platform I was referring to, May next year, I hope to see you all there, is dedicating one full day to climate change and climate change adaptation related themes and topics. And it offers us the opportunity also to have a ministerial roundtable which is going to emphasize on precisely the topic of DRR, climate change, and SDGs, and also a high-level dialogue on achieving the SDGs through climate and disaster risk, and working sessions that are going to be discussing many of the topics that we have listened to throughout the day today. National DRR strategies and how they link with national adaptation plans. This is something that we cannot continue on going like today. Countries are investing a lot of money in developing national adaptation plans and are also being requested to develop national DRR plans, both by 2020. If they don't coordinate and work together on the development of these plans, you know, it's like they are going to be missing one, like a chair of only three, how you say? Legs, exactly, thanks. So let's avoid having a chair like the one we have here at the Place des Nations. Although that's another, it's related to another very tragic issue, but anyway. So the opportunity is there, and we expect to have out of the global platform very actionable recommendations for policymakers that will be brought for informing other important meetings that are happening right after the global platform next May, namely the high-level political forum that's going to emphasize on inclusiveness, and we have discussed a lot about that today, and it's going to also look into SDG 13. So lots of opportunities there. And also the climate summit that the Secretary General has convened for September in 2019. So if we talk about, you know, what are the pathways of opening up spaces for landing these agendas in a substantive and meaningful way with governments, that's one big opportunity there, and we have to actually make the best use of it. So, that thanks.
To someone's comment at the back, if climate action happened at the speed at which forums and meetings take place, we would be in a much better world today. My goodness, it's a busy agenda coming up. But I was struck by your comment that DRR is climate risk, because we've heard today DRR is climate risk. We've heard climate action is human rights. We've heard humanitarians are dealing with the effects of climate change. We've heard climate action is development. And in the end, you know, we're talking about the same thing, aren't we? So a strong message towards breaking down those silos. We're going to end with Arnel, and perhaps you can just bring us back to earth in terms of how we take this forward in a way that really benefits the affected states. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And well, there was a comment earlier about human rights, and the Philippines was actually one of those countries that that lobbied for the inclusion of human rights language in the Paris Agreement, and we're very proud of that. I've been handling climate change issues for about 3 years. It's not a long time. I'm sure most of you in the room have handled climate change issues a lot longer. But one thing that I noticed is that the silos that we've been talking about, they still exist, but a lot has been done to try to break them. And I know this because, for instance, in the Human Rights Council, there are annual resolutions about climate change. In the WHO, the World Health Organization, they actually have a work program on the relations between health and environment, and that includes climate change. In the International Labour Organization, they also have a specific agenda, precisely because rising heat in the workplace affects worker productivity. So steps are being undertaken to make sure that that the international organizations, that all of us here, you know, we actually work together. But as I said earlier, I think a lot can still be done. And I really do hope that this special IPCC report will hopefully the very last clarion call for all of us to take action. And how do we measure that action? It's all in our nationally determined contributions. So I do hope that all of us here, all of our members, all of our countries, you know, we submit NDCs that reflect higher ambition, higher goals. So I guess that's it.
So while our panelists take their seats, we're going to play for you a short video message that we received from the President of the Marshall Islands, who has some news to share.
The Paris Agreement on climate change gave us rare hope. For my country, the Marshall Islands, and many others, it was a promise of survival we fought hard for. My country is made up of over 1,000 islands, only a few feet above sea level. Warming could raise the Pacific Ocean far above that. Today, our people live in fear that it could flood The Paris Agreement on climate change gave us rare hope. For my country, the Marshall Islands, and many others, it was a promise of survival we fought hard for. My country is made up of over 1,000 islands, only a few feet above sea level. Warming could raise the Pacific Ocean far above that. Today, our people live in fear that king tides could flood our homes, claiming lives even as we sleep. But we don't stand alone. Everyone's way of life is under threat. Fortunately, fighting climate change is an opportunity. Renewable energy gives us access to nature's enormous wealth, jobs, health, and prosperity. Despite growing momentum, not enough is being done to keep us safe. If warming goes above 1.5 degrees Celsius, our fate is sealed. But it's not too late if every nation steps up and does more by 2020. Our coalition of 48 most vulnerable nations called for a leaders' summit that I'm honored to host this 22nd of November. The summit will be entirely online, making use of solutions at hand for a carbon-free global gathering. It embraces the spirit of inclusivity, or Talanoa. We are all connected. I invite any leader prepared to do more by 2020 to show solidarity and join our summit. I have faith that together we succeed. Everyone can contribute. Join us.
The carbon footprint that we create as we talk about reducing carbon footprints. So congratulations, Marshall Islands, for putting your money where your mouth is. I shall invite our closing panel to join me on stage, and while I do that, I will make my own appeal. Please come ahead. That I've heard many times today this importance of storytelling and really communicating that narrative of the human impacts of climate change. So please use us at ERIN News. That's what we do, and we're here to hear those stories and to try to communicate them. So if you are either a country affected by climate change or one of the countries trying to do innovative things to address it, reach out to us and let us be part of the solution in communicating what this really looks like on the ground. Hello. Hi. So we now have our closing session after a long and quite full day. So I think the gentlemen who've just joined me, and I'm going to, are you ready to roll? I can just introduce you and we launch right in? Right. Always ready, good. To my right is Ovais Sarmar, the UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll be very direct. Thank you very much to all the organizers for bringing us here together for the first ever humanitarian dialogue as a subsequent to the release of the IPCC report. I have listened to many interventions today and read a lot about what's contained in the report. We in the Secretariat, the UNFCCC, based in Bonn, Germany, extremely busy preparing for the COP this year in December, and I hope to see all of you in COP. So let me share a few remarks that I'd like to share with you, especially coming out at the recent release of the IPCC report and what it means to us in the process in UNFCCC, to the presidencies that we're working with. As we all know, and you heard this, and a lot of it will be a repeat, but the report confirms what we suspected, that humanity must now act with utmost urgency. The bad news is that the world has already warmed by 1 degree, as we all know, due to human activity, and that's been proven. We know that the impacts of climate change are here, and they're already affecting people in many parts of the world, ecosystems, livelihoods around the world. We heard this morning a very emotional and a very compelling personal story of the difference between 1.5 and 2 and what it means. And having worked with IOM for more than 25 years, I know what it means to be on the ground and see the actual suffering. And I've always said this, that we cannot take action, implement climate change or protection of refugees, migrants, or displaced populations in conference rooms. That happens on the ground. Affecting people, as we often say, is a kind of way of saying it's already destroying lives and communities around the world. While numbers and statistics are important, we can never forget what we are dealing with. And those are real people, real lives, emotions, feelings, desperation. If we don't act urgently to limit global warming, more and more people will be affected, directly or indirectly. Climate change, as we all know, especially in this city, the humanitarian city, it respects no borders. It recognizes no political party, but it is coming all the same unless we pull together, re-embrace multilateralism, complete the Paris Agreement, and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Sounds like a lot of work? It's an incredible amount of work. But here's the good news. It is still possible, but our window of opportunity is rapidly closing. Let's take a closer look at what this report, why is this report so valuable and how it fits into the UNFCCC process. First, it's valuable because it helps us understand the risk of missing the 1.5 degree goal. I've already outlined some of those in a broader sense, but of course there are many, many more risks. But the report is also helpful because it clarifies what achieving that goal means, especially with respect to sustainable development. Climate change and sustainable development, as you all have discussed, are intricately linked. Better put, climate change is a threat multiplier. Left unaddressed, it has the potential to take every major challenge humanity faces and make it worse. This includes challenges such as migration, security, poverty, equality, and many others. But why is this very linkage that provides our best opportunity for widespread change? Because just as runaway climate change can make these problems worse, if we address climate change, as we also heard, we can tackle a broad swath of some of our biggest challenges, and there are huge opportunities in that. That's why climate change isn't just about goal number 13 of the SDG. It's intricately connected to each one. And it's why we need to constantly look at the SDGs. But let's be clear, things are not always very clear-cut. For example, we know that through urgent mitigation and adaptation action, we can protect the poor and disadvantaged populations. But we also need to consider that some poor and disadvantaged populations may be disproportionately affected by mitigation action alone, and may face larger challenges associated with poverty, eradication, and reducing inequalities compared to the status quo. At the same time, we know the world needs urgent action and ambition, both in mitigation and adaptation. The special report is absolutely very, very clear on this. So it's a delicate balance. What's clear is that going forward, we will need a mix of systems transitions driven by increased investment in adaptation and mitigation. We'll also need policy instruments, behavioral change, and acceleration to technological innovation. And a lot of those examples have been put forward today. That's a quick look at why the IPCC report is so valuable. But how does it fit in the various broad spectrum of events and policy initiatives around the world? It reinforces the ongoing collaboration between many different organizations, in particular between our organization and IPCC itself. Throughout the years, every milestone in the climate change process has been directly and powerfully informed by the IPCC report. And for the UNFCCC process, this is particularly special report, or special report, if you like, given its importance to the evolution of ambition in the climate change negotiations. Beyond 2018, the report can inform the global stocktake. This stocktake will itself be informed by the outcomes of the 6th assessment report to be completed in 2022. That's why UNFCCC is committed to working with IPCC and all the partners, especially those that are here today. Ladies and gentlemen, in the short amount of time we have, I hope to have impressed upon you the importance of the report itself and what it means to our process and the SDG goals and how they are all interconnected. But I'd like to leave you with this. We are at a critical point in history, but while the odds seem very long, humanity has always been up to its challenges. We have done it before and we can do it again. But it won't happen with hope alone. We must do the hard work. I urge you to work at personal level. Article 12 of the Paris Agreement is extremely important. Read it if you haven't done so, or reread it. It's extremely important. And it's one of the most simple, straightforward articles which calls for action at all levels, at the individual level. And that's what we need. And at no time is this more important than now. We urgently need to finalize the Paris Agreement implementation and release its full potential. And that's what we are working towards to make it happen in Katowice in December this year. So together, I hope, and I really request all of you to remain engaged, to provide your inputs through the Talanoa process that you have so emphatically discussed and put together. Bring it forward, and we'll take it in the Talanoa special session in Katowice during the first or second week, and it'll inform the policymakers, the political process, and hopefully we'll come to a good outcome at Katowice in December this year. So finally, I can personally make a personal commitment that we can address the climate change challenge. It can be done, and it will be done, and we have the means and the moral obligation to do it. So let's get together and work hard and remain committed to doing this. Thank you very much.
So to be clear, your personal commitment is that you are going to single-handedly resolve the climate change challenge?
The UNFCCC process, which includes everyone, all of us, yes.
Very good to have that on record. I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Deo Saran, who is back on stage of the Fiji presidency, to try, it's quite a valiant goal, to recap the key recommendations that we have heard throughout today.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to recap. As you rightly say, it's quite a challenge, but I would like at the outset to thank you all for coming here today, especially the IPCC scientists that have enlightened us with their insights from their important report. In fact, our important report. It is very important that this dialogue is happening, and Fiji is very proud to be co-sponsors of this dialogue. There was a strong call today for more dialogues connecting climate, humanitarian, and development perspectives. The science is clear, and the humanitarian experience is clear. Climate is already having impacts on humanitarian work, and things are getting worse. Half a degree more will substantially increase the humanitarian challenges. At 2 degrees, it will become even harder to effectively help people in need. Both human and financial costs are rising dramatically. The IPCC report also speaks about solutions and shows that we can still keep the global warming below 1.5 degrees and adapt to the rising risk while achieving the SDGs. Now, these are very positive findings, but we need a substantial increase in ambition, firstly, and secondly, act very quickly. We cannot wait. However, one of the biggest challenges that we have had today and we face is the question of political will. My Prime Minister and COP23 President over the last 2 years have stressed this at every forum throughout the globe, and we are still hearing this today at this late hour. The Humanitarian Committee made it clear today that for more ambition, call for more ambitious action on mitigation and adaptation, with particular focus on the most vulnerable people, especially those affected by natural disasters and conflicts. We have heard that this has implications on climate finance, which needs to be targeted towards more vulnerable people, including at the local level. Humanitarian actors also need to adapt to deal with changing risk. This includes a strong focus on anticipation and prevention, including forecast-based financing, more emphasis on partnerships across climate humanitarian continuum, jointly building resilience and achieving SDGs, a stronger focus on local action, empowering those in the front lines of risks, ensuring voices from those affected that are heard where decisions are made. Humanitarians also need to be ambassadors, telling stories and bringing this evidence about climate impacts in the humanitarian context to the fore, and convincing everyone to act with more ambition in achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. I hope that you all will be briefing your ministers of the importance of the IPCC 1.5 degrees report in the Turner dialogue process, and working with them to bring to Katowice strong stories on the opportunities that we can be leveraged and shared to enhance the ambition in the national determined contributions. I want to say how appreciative we are of your efforts and your commitment. It gives us, the COP23 presidency team, renewed optimism that no matter how hard the challenge, we have the vision, the ability, and the will to implement the Paris Agreement. Fiji will take conclusions of these meetings, which will be compiled by the organizers into the Toronto dialogue process. And we call upon all you to continue to join us in the journey to step up ambition at COP24 in Katowice and beyond. And I thank you for coming and supporting us. Thank you.
And finally, I would like to turn to Ambassador Manuel Wessler of the host country, Switzerland, head of the Swiss Humanitarian Aid Unit.
Thank you very much, Heba. As member states only work during morning sessions, actually it's quite impressive to see still the turnout. And this, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, is what it's needed, this kind of commitment, even on Friday, 10 past 5 o'clock, to be here and to continue the discussion, to continue the dialogue. The challenges we have ahead, we heard it again and again, are tremendous, are enormous. And the global warming is a challenging reality. In this recently released report, we have now heard and have it as an evidence what we actually knew, that indeed human-induced climate change has increased. But during today's discussions, also based on this report, we have seen that there are possibilities, there are ways to limit the global warming to this 1.5 degree Celsius, scientifically, technically, but also economically. So we see some silver lining on the horizon. However, of course, the mitigation efforts that we have so far in place are not enough. We need more to do, and we heard it again and again in an impressive way also by these video clips. We have to see the approach as a concert. We have, of course, the Paris Agreement, which is indispensable to achieve also the other landmarks, like the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in the sort of the third approach, of course, Sendai. These three landmarks have to be addressed in parallel, and only with this concerted effort it's possible. The humanitarian challenges that are caused by climate change are in a difficult time where the humanitarian system is under tremendous stress. We have over 130 million people in need. Last year only the UN appeal was asking for 25 billion, and this was only addressed to 50% in humanitarian resources. So the humanitarian system in these days are already under stress, and there are limits how much you can still get out of this system. That's why we have to look at other systems. We have to bring other systems, other efforts into this concert of addressing the challenges ahead. We owe it to the future generations. Today, I think we have done with this dialogue, and I want to underline dialogue, a significant step in the right direction, bringing together the humanitarian community, diplomatic community, and the climate science, or scientists, in order to address and to look at the latest scientific evidence, to share story, even poems, but also to discuss the necessity to confront the humanitarian challenges together. It is clear, today we do not leave with a so-called, in quotation mark, the silver bullet, how to address it. But what I want to underline is, and it was mentioned also by a previous speaker, this invitation to continue the dialogue. We have to get together, also on a Friday at 5 o'clock. We have this conference in Poland, Katowice, for the 24th conference of the parties. We have indeed Geneva next year with the global platform for disaster risk reduction in May, and of course the 33rd conference on the Red Cross and Red Crescent. All important platforms to address these challenges ahead. And I warmly invite everybody here in this room and his or her government to be present there, to come to these platforms and to show, A, with your presence, but B, with your input, your concern and your readiness to address the challenges ahead. I want to thank you all for your presence, for your contribution. I want to thank in particular, also in the name of the organizer of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the Climate Action Network, of course, Netherlands, your participation. I want also to thank Heba for a great moderation of this multifaceted challenges that we have ahead. And I look forward to seeing you, be it in Poland or in Geneva next year. Have a safe trip back home. Thank you very much. And don't sort of take this spirit of Geneva with you in order to push the agenda ahead. Thank you very much.
Manuel has covered most of the thank yous that I had been instructed to make, so thank you for that. But I shall also thank the Club Suisse de la Presse, the Swiss Press Club, which did the webcast today, and the many people who you've seen on either side of the stage who've been doing all of the organizing for several days in advance of this meeting. So thank you to you as well. Finally, one last pitch. For those who have not yet experienced the video art experience, it will be available until 6 p.m. in room 8, which is on the 3rd floor near where the breakout groups were held. And it is only on today, so this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Have a nice weekend, everyone.